Welcome to worship with the Presbyterian Church in Westfield. Let me ask you something. If you've ever felt that the world is just being flipped upside down and that nothing seems to make sense anymore, you're not alone. And in fact, 2,000 years ago, Jesus was doing this to the people that he was preaching to in his most famous sermon, the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus looks out on an entire populace, and especially his own disciples, preaching to them, and is describing a world they can scarcely understand, but they want to be true. He starts, as we did last week, with the Beatitudes. So if you are just jumping in and joining us now, I encourage you, go back and watch that video from just last week as we explored the Beatitudes and how Jesus describes a world for us that sometimes feels too good to be true. Today, we take a different look at it. Today, we get to ask questions of Jesus about what does it mean for us to live in the world around us? What does it mean for us to try to live out our faith every day? What does it mean, even if we don't know if it's faith, but we're curious about something? Something about this man, Jesus, is interesting and drawing us in. And what does it simply mean to be Christian? We get to dive into that today. I invite you to join along as we explore Flipped, a world turned upside down by the vision of God's own purpose for the world around us.
This is holy ground. Heaven is upside down and flipped. The seven kings crowned. Power is different now and flipped. God's kingdom comes about. Love flipped. Love turned inside out. Love no matter what. Love no matter what. Love turned inside out. Love no matter what. Love flipped right side out. Love no matter what. Flipped. Flipped. Love no matter what. Flipped. Flipped.
Continuing with the Sermon on the Mount, here we have Jesus beginning the actual sermon following the Beatitudes. He says, "You are the salt of the earth. But if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything, but is thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A city built on a hill cannot be hid. No one, after lighting a lamp, puts it under the bushel basket, but on the lampstand, and it gives light to all the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill them. For truly, I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." This is our word today from Jesus. Thanks be to God. Consider for a moment how it is that you stay tethered, anchored, grounded. Consider for a moment that. Is it being amongst family, being away from family? Is it having time to yourself? going on a walk with a friend, playing with the kids. There's so many different ways in which we as people find a touchstone in our daily lives that help make the rest of everything else we face make a little bit more sense. And I believe that in the Christian tradition, we've been given a gift of a touchstone in our own faith that keeps us grounded, keeps us rooted. And I believe that it's the Sermon on the Mount. Now, all parts of Scripture can be important, and I'm not denying anything else that's going on in Scripture, but I think there is something special about the Sermon on the Mount. Typically, when we talk about this particular teaching of Jesus, people have come to see it as either being an extreme example that nobody could ever live up to, or it becomes very rigidly the rules by which we must live, or else. And in fact, if we read this in just a really black and white and literal statement, Jesus seems to go with the latter on this. He actually says, at one point, that is part of the scriptures that I'm reflecting on right now. He goes as far as to say that he plans not to take one letter from the law. We must follow the letter of the law until that time at which the kingdom of heaven comes. I'm not saying anything to take away from that, but there's something deeper, I believe, going on, because when we look at the entirety of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is describing a world that exists, but many of us fail to see. It's there, but we paint almost a veneer over it with culture and with language and with our own ideas and our own experiences, our own expectations, those things that we've been taught. That our culture tries, I don't think consciously always, but tries to eradicate a reality that Christ is able to see and is trying to point out even 2,000 years ago to his followers. There's something more real that Jesus is pointing to than their everyday lives. And they were ready for something new. And to be honest with us where we are now, a global pandemic, with an economic crisis, with social crises all happening around us, I think many of us would like to be able to see a world flipped on its head, because quite frankly, the one that we've known seems to have already done that. And so Jesus comes to us, and in the Sermon on the Mount, he points to the law and says, not one letter of it will be struck down until the kingdom arrives. But just before this, and throughout it, he paints that picture. He paints a picture of a different reality for us that I think gives us hope. So when I ask, what is your tether? I think for many of us, those of us who are spiritual, those of us who have a sense of faith, I think it's compassion. Compassion, that form of love that we call compassion, I think is the very touchstone of our entire faith. If we were to talk about Christian life in terms of meditation, which we very rarely do, but probably should more, if we talk about that in terms of mindfulness, I would say that the act of compassion, living with compassion, is the very touchstone that allows for all the facade of reality to float away, to drift away, to fall away, and for the most real thing in existence to come through. The compassion itself is it. And there are a few different ways in which it comes up. And in order to be able to kind of understand where I'm going with this, is we put so much stake on culture being real. That our daily lives being the most real thing that we can see or touch or understand. And yet it's always changing. It's always falling away from one generation to the next. It seems that all that we knew hits the restart button. And there are a couple of examples that I'd like to share with you of scientists who have talked about this in recent years. One of them is Lera Boroditsky. She is a cognitive scientist who was trained at Northwestern and Stanford, so she's got the chops from the academic side. And she did a TED Talk not that long ago that I hope that we'll be sharing with this video, but to some degree. But she did this TED Talk, and I'm not going to go into the whole thing because I want you to look it up and see it. But she's trying to get across the idea that language, and I would go as far as to say that language and culture and so many other aspects of life does this, but she's pointing at language, that language shapes at a fundamental level the way we think. She's got this great example. I mean, she's got several of them that are just phenomenal, but there's one in particular that I want to share with you. She looks at the word bridge. Simple word. A thing that crosses either a body of water or a low point in the ground by which we can traverse. Well, she says, look at the word bridge. Now, look at the word bridge and go talk to somebody in Germany and show them a bridge. Now, the reason this matters is that there are some languages where every single word is shaped or defined in part because of a gendered pronoun kind of use, pronominal use. And Germany is one of these languages. And she says if you go talk to somebody in Germany and you ask them to describe a bridge, they will, without a doubt, use words like elegant or beautiful, etc. She, I'm sure, could cite specific studies because she's an academic. She then goes on to say, but if you go to Spain or you talk to someone who's a native speaker of Spanish, and you ask them the same question, they will relate to the item or the word bridge in almost entirely masculine language. They'll say it's strong or it's long or something that we typically culturally attribute to masculinity instead of femininity. You see, culture itself assigns these different ways of being. It's a construct in gender, and we can get into this another day, but gender itself has been fluid in history, and the way that we talk about things being masculine and feminine, in fact, can sometimes be fairly mutable and changeable. When we take a look at the color pink and the color blue, until after World War I, the standard color for little boys to wear was pink, because pink was the diminutive of red, which was a masculine, manly color. Blue, which was considered more feminine. See any painting of the Virgin Mary, the diminutive of that, the baby blue, is for little girls. It was not until sometime between World War I and World War II that began to shift. All this is important just because we're trying to set up and understand how changeable our culture really, really is. And these things that we consider to be universal, that we consider to be set in stone, very often aren't. And this becomes very, very important when we start to look around our world and look for something that's more grounded, more rooted, something that we can trust, something that we can actually stand on and know that we're in a place that is right. And the Sermon on the Mount gives us this. Just before Jesus starts to talk about the law and how the law will continue to stand until the kingdom of heaven comes, it's all part of a larger setup, I believe, of what Jesus is doing and how Jesus sees the law. The law itself is meant to hem us in, to constrain us, to restrict us, to prevent us from doing something that otherwise we would do. To fulfill the intent of the law means going beyond it. And I think in a very real way, Jesus is giving us the keys, essentially, to how do we get beyond the law? How do we make the law itself no longer necessary? It's compassion. It is love. And he starts to define it by two words, both of which across all the different languages are fairly elemental. Salt is a thing, so its thingness cannot be undone depending on what language you tell it in. You can say sel, you can say salt, you can say it in any number of languages. There's still a real thing there that is what we're trying to describe. For example, there's this wonderful physicist, Richard Feynman, who in 1973 was interviewed by Yorkshire Public Television. And this noted scientist was being asked by his interviewer a bunch of different questions and how he came to think in the way that he does. And he has this wonderful story that he told about his dad. And what he does is he says, I was going along, walking with my father, much like we are now. And his father pointed down at the ground and said, son, do you know what that is? And the son said, well, it's a bird. So he says, that is a brown-throated thrush. And then Richard's father goes on to describe that bird's name, or to rename that bird in several different languages. And at the end of it, he says, now, do you know anything about that bird? And the whole point of it was to uncover a very real truth. The naming of something has nothing to do with whether or not we actually know it. There's nothing to naming something that can constitute knowledge of something. We have to get below it. We have to go deeper into it. And so it is with the way that we get inside of Jesus' head. I think in a very real sense, Jesus is trying to describe the law as something that is only necessary as long as it's necessary. Meaning that if we live with compassion, if we live for the sake of compassion, the law is no longer necessary. One does not need to be told not to steal if we have compassion for the person from whom we might be stealing. We do not need to go out and hurt our loved ones or betray a spouse or a close friend if we have compassion and love for them. That when we are centered and we are grounded, the law itself ceases to matter. And in so doing, Jesus is fulfilling what the law is all about. The law is to prevent us from doing certain things, but it in itself cannot create the kingdom that Jesus is trying to bring about. So Jesus says, listen, it is going to be there until my kingdom comes. Now you are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the earth. What does that mean? To be salt. Yes, it gives flavor to things. For us to be salt and be in the presence of others allows for the beauty that lies within them to come up to the surface, to be more noticeable. We elevate that which is around us. Because living in compassion for someone else, they shine through more fully than they would have. That's what salt does. It also purifies and preserves. That in our very own presence, in the way that we live with compassion for others, they too are able to experience what it is to live with compassion because they are more secure. And to be a light in the darkness, to stand as a beacon of hope, to be a lighthouse that other ships can come to be a place of safety. Because through our compassion that we can offer to somebody else, we become their safety net. We become safe harbor. We become the place in which they become rooted. So if we go back and we look at the Sermon on the Mount, and especially these short verses that Jesus is using to start the whole thing, he starts with statements about the law that deceptively are about upturning the entire law, flipping it all on its head, and giving us a new way of understanding the world in which simple acts of kindness, a posture of love and compassion, not only roots us and grounds us and keeps us individually more tethered in a world that feels like it's changing all the time, but more importantly, our very compassion is the very thing that changes all the world around us, one person, one relationship at a time.